So I have finally put together my Dream Team Renegade University webinar. It's called Talkin' Shit, the History of African American Culture. And it will be co-taught by me and Kamasi Hill. Many of you know Kamasi as a guest on Unregistered, but you may not know that Kamasi has a PhD in African American religion and culture from Northwestern University. He was born and raised in Detroit to a black nationalist family. He attended Howard University, and as you will see, his intellectual chops are inferior to no one's. Also, as a special guest celebrity student, although he wanted to take this course, in fact, he asked me to design this course for him, and so I did, we will have the great, and again, another unregistered guest, Hotep Jesus, who will bring a lot of energy and fire and a tremendous intellectual curiosity. This guy reads books about history for fun, something even I don't do. Kamasi and I and Hotep Jesus are going to have a great time, and there are already many people signing up for this course. It begins on November 3rd. That's a Tuesday. It'll meet every Tuesday in November. We have, I think it's only 10 or 11 days before it begins, so get your tickets now before it fills up. This is going to be a kind of course on African American history and culture that you will never find at any other university, and we guarantee you that after having taken this course, you will be able to win arguments with anybody from Harvard or Yale or Princeton who even specializes in African American history, because many of the things that Kamasi and I discuss are taboo in the normal colleges. So go to Renegade University and sign up for Talkin' Shit, the History of African American Culture. It meets Tuesdays in November at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. We hope to see you there. It is going to be an experience. Thanks. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. As many of you may know, I have been working for many years on a book on the history of United States foreign policy, and 4 of the chapters in that book, which I've actually completed, argue that U.S. policy before and during the war guaranteed the realization of the Holocaust. I also argue that from the very beginning, even before the beginning of the United States, America's founders and all of its subsequent presidents and foreign policymakers have been committed, until Donald Trump, to the United States as a global hegemonic empire. My guest this week recently published a book in which he makes similar but definitely different arguments. In this interview, we discuss whether or not the United States actually intended fully and was committed to the global imperial project before World War II. He argues it wasn't. And also, we have a brief disagreement, which we want to take up later in a subsequent episode, on whether the U.S. carries any responsibility for the enactment of the Holocaust. I want to say that in this 2-hour interview, Stephen Wertheim and I debate and argue and disagree seriously on many topics. But I have to say, this is the kind of conversation I always wanted to have when I was a student, a graduate student, and a professor in colleges and universities. For those of you who are interested in my arguments that I present in this interview, go to renegadeuniversity.com and take my courses. One is called Dangerous Nation, which is a history of U.S. foreign policy from the beginning of the Republic through the 19th century, and my course called The Great Blowback on World War II and U.S. involvement in it and its relationship to the Holocaust. But for now, watch this interview, which I think is a model for intellectual disagreement and debate. This is my interview with Stephen Wertheim. I am joined from, I believe, New York City. Are you in New York, Stephen?
I'm in D.C.
You're in
Sorry to
DC.
disappoint.
Oh, of course, because now you work for Power. I forgot.
Yeah.
Joined from Washington, D.C. by Stephen Wertheim, who is a professor at Columbia University and the director, am I right, of the Quincy Institute.
So I'm a mere research scholar at Columbia University. That's fine. I appreciate the upgrade.
Yeah.
And
Anytime.
I am, but now I'm going to downgrade. I'm the deputy director of research and policy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it upped you one area, but the thing is that the Quincy
Evens out.
Yeah, it does. The Quincy, though, was your idea. Am I right about that?
I was one of 5 co-founders.
I keep inflating you. Okay, I've got to stop.
You inflate, you deflate. It's going to be an interesting interview, I can tell.
Always, but this is true. You did just come out with a book called Tomorrow the World about essentially what I've been working on for many years now. I won't tell you how many because it's embarrassing, but in fact, I might have been working on my book longer than you've been working on your. I bet I have. Yours was your dissertation, became a book called Tomorrow the World on the history of U.S. foreign policy, but focusing in particular on the U.S. since World War II or the beginning of World War II. And you make a couple of really important arguments, one of which I very much agree with and one of which I 50% agree with. So let's talk about, so we want to talk about the book. We want to talk about, which will of course lead us into many discussions about the history of U.S. foreign policy. Then we want to talk about the Quincy Institute, how it came about, what it is, how it's distinctive, what you guys are about, because it's a very interesting story for people who don't know. It made the news last year when it launched, and it was announced that the funders for it, the primary, I guess, funders for it was George Soros, or the Soros Foundation, and the Koch brothers. And people were like, what? How could this possibly be? And a lot of us who have taken money from both Soros and the Koch brothers over the years knew, we're like, yeah, of course, they're both anti-war. But we'll get into that later. Let's dig in, because the audience loves them some history and they love foreign policy, believe it or not, my audience, generally speaking. So this is going to be a real treat for people who are fans of that stuff. Because Stephen and I both have been studying this very same topic for many, many years. And as I told you, we have some interesting agreements and interesting disagreements. So lay out the thesis for Tomorrow the World.
So it proceeds from a controversial premise, first of all, which is that we do not understand in the year 2020 when, much less why, the United States decided to become the dominant military power in the world. Something we take for granted, we, meaning basically the foreign policy establishment in Washington, the people who actually make U.S. foreign policy, they take this for granted. It's the premise from which foreign policy debate proceeds in the town behind me.
Right.
But scholars have not actually squarely posed the question, how do we get from, the founding of the country where entangling alliances were verboten, and that tradition maintained itself for what is still most of America's history, to the point that we have now. So first of all, how did America's role in the world get reconceived such that military dominance on a global scale with a global projection of power became the accepted role of America in the world. Not only that, how did military dominance rise to axiomatic status such that there is a strong political consensus around it, and indeed, basically, if you don't agree with that premise, you can expect to be labeled an isolationist and beyond the pale, outside the sphere of legitimate discourse.
Right.
So that's the premise. I haven't even started on the argument, but right there, you're nodding, and maybe you're objecting to part of that.
No, I hear you. I'm just hearing you.
Okay. Oh, you're hearing me. Okay.
I agree that is
Fine.
That is the dominant, or has been a dominant premise. Yes.
All right. So then, the way I answer this question is to zero in on what turned out to be just 18 months between the fall of France to Nazi Germany in the middle of 1940 and the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor that got the United States into World War II. And it turned out that here was something like a decision for dominance, in which it wasn't just that American officials and intellectuals were trying to figure out how to react to the war situation. Should the United States intervene in the war? Should it merely aid the Allies short of war? Or should it stay out completely, guard the Western Hemisphere? They were also looking ahead, far into the future, and deciding that the very nature of American interests and responsibilities in the world as they had known it needed to change and essentially become global. And so it's at this moment, I argue, that part of the American foreign policy elite undergoes a significant change in thinking, comes to conceive of America as the dominant military power, and indeed has this vision that the United States will maintain dominance, not just as an immediate safeguard to defeat the Axis powers, but for something like the perpetual future.
Mm-hmm. So I agree with you that the United States foreign policy elite, as you put it, or establishment, did certainly seize the opportunity presented by World War II and did begin to put forward publicly, as well as a lot privately, ideas and plans for just what you're saying, for the United States to assume its rightful place as the dominant superpower in the world. No doubt that World War II was a kind of turning point, in my view. Here's where I differ from you. You say that this was new. And I know the book is much more nuanced about this. You do talk about some imperialist ambitions of a sort before 1940, but I simply see a very, very long tradition going all the way back before the American Revolution in the minds of virtually every important president and many of the most important senators and many of the most important public intellectuals and military leaders, I'm talking about the 1750s all the way up to 1940. I see over and over again, and I can give you the names, I can give you the quotes, and you know them. And it's not like you're unaware of this. And I also I am aware that the United States could not act on that, could not achieve that goal simply because they weren't ready economically and the military wasn't quite prepared yet. But damn, dude, the ambition to be rulers of the world, I'm talking John Adams, I'm talking George Washington, I'm talking Thomas Jefferson, undoubtedly, who invented the Marine Corps and began nation building and regime change in 1802. I'm talking about the Republican Party during the Civil War. I'm talking about, of course, during the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt, Beveridge from Indiana, the senator, incredibly colorful imperialist thinker at the time. Admiral, do you pronounce it Mahan or Mahan? I've never understood how you pronounce that. Mahan?
Mahan is what I'm going with.
Isn't it funny?
What do I, who knows?
I'm going to stump you again. How about Adolf, Berle? You know how that's pronounced for real? I just learned this. I've been writing about this guy for years, and someone just said, no, it's pronounced. I always said Adolf Berle. It's Burley.
I was going to say Burley, actually.
He was one of the main. Okay, so he was.
I think I was alerted to this, but at some point in the dissertation research, People were saying Burley, and okay.
So Adolf Burley was one of Franklin Roosevelt's top advisors, specializing in foreign policy for much of the time. And he was one of the guys in the administration who said simply straight up at the very beginning of the war, hey, you know what? The Brits are probably going to lose this, or at least come out short, and we're going to come out on top, and we should seize that. But let's go back to the deeper history, if you don't mind. Pre 1940, and I'm also going to challenge you on your. I think you're off by 1 year, by the way. I think it begins in 39. We'll get that into.
Okay.
So I had, I got my PhD at Columbia in history, U.S. history as well, and I've been studying and teaching this stuff for 25 years, and I did not know. I had lots of stuff to say about the Founding Fathers that was negative and critical, but I did not know until I started this book that to a man, every one of the major Founding Fathers, and probably every one of them actually, was an imperialist to the bone in terms of their vision, their desire, their identity. So these guys all talked about how much they identified with Julius Caesar and Attila the Hun and Alexander the Great, and they had busts, statues placed in their mansions, Monticello and Mount Vernon, right, etc. John Adams was talking about in the 1750s when he was a school teacher, Stephen Wertheim. He was talking about becoming the ruler of the world, in which he would be determining who would fit what role, who would do what job. I mean, kind of, and I've said this to people, John Adams, many of these guys, if you put them on a couch today, most psychiatrists would put them somewhere in the DSM. They exhibit megalomaniacal, possibly schizophrenic, psychotic fantasies. So, I mean, what do you say?
But good fodder for a Broadway show.
For sure. Well, yeah. If you completely rewrite all of history that's ever happened, it's a great show. I've seen Hamilton. I didn't know they were all black. I thought that was really curious. After having studied this for so long, I was like, damn, those guys were all black this whole time, owning slaves and everything. All right.
Liberties were taken. Yes. Okay. So, it'll be interesting to see whether we truly disagree or
right.
what.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because I will note that you said that you see the United States with imperial ambitions and behavior throughout, and that I'm off by just a year. So what am I off about by a year?
Yeah, the specific planning for World War II and the outcome of it.
Okay.
So I think it's pretty clear that it begins with the Council on Foreign Relations on East 65th Street in 1939. And then with the invasion of Poland, Germany's invasion of Poland, they take the train from Penn Station down to Washington, where you are, and they go straight to the State Department office, and they meet with all the heads of the State Department, and the State Department says, okay, guys, you got it, write up the plans, and it'll be called the War and Peace Studies Project, and work in collaboration in secret during the war to make sure that we are the superpower at the end of it. That's in 39. So, but that's
true. Okay, so
go ahead.
We'll say more about that. We'll say more about
jumping
that.
ahead there.
So yes, I mean, I am with you, and I'm with the many scholars who see the United States expanding its power in ruthless ways from the get-go. There's no argument there. None other than Thomas Jefferson says that the United States should be an empire of or for liberty. What he has in mind in that formulation is conquest across what became North America. Didn't necessarily have to be, could have gone beyond that in Jefferson's time, but nevertheless, with the catch, this was the liberty part, that once colonized by U.S./European settlers, new territories would be incorporated into the federal union on the basis of equality. So that's Jefferson's view. We can go into the views of the founders, but if you look at the record of vast U.S. population growth, territorial expansion, and then what is indisputably imperial conquest in the war against Spain, 1898, the United States takes Puerto Rico, which remains something like a colony to this day, takes the Philippines, and rules it for 48 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the United States there's no doubt that the United States was a colonial power in the most conventional sense of a colonial empire, right? So this is all true. So but the complicating feature. Oh, hold on! I want to make one more concession to you. One more concession.
Okay.
It may also be that the founders and succeeding generations through the 19th century and into the 20th century, prior to World War II, had the kind of same scale of ambition in terms of U.S. Capabilities. Material power was this much, and yet American leaders envisioned, this much. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, for example, when it was issued, written by John Quincy Adams, proclaimed a kind of U.S. leadership over the entire Western Hemisphere at a time when the U.S. clearly didn't have the Navy to make it so. It was at that time a kind of profession of a philosophy of history that, the United States preferred to see the European colonizers disappear from the New World, and said nothing about how the United States would act to make it so. Also, though, forswore U.S. intervention in the old world, the corrupt old world of Europe. And that's getting now to the part where I'm going to go on offense, such as it is in this response,
Ready.
And say that there was at least a norm, a public norm, widely subscribed to by, leaders in every political party, basically, that while they wanted the United States to expand its realm, while they were willing to, act coercively to make that happen, and while they were also exceptionalists in the sense that they saw the United States as superior, as representing a superior political model to others, and expected the world in some fashion to become more like America, although of course never quite getting there, because America has to be the chosen country and superior to all others. Mm-hmm. They still maintained this norm against what they construed as U.S. entanglements in the corrupt old world, centered in Europe, with Asia playing a secondary role, because you could argue, supposedly, I guess, about whether the Philippines could fit into the expanded New World domain or not. So, at some point, so you could argue that maybe I make too much of the breaching of that norm, and there wasn't really much chance for the non-interventionist position to win out on the eve of World War II. And yet, at least there seems to be still a puzzle as to how we move from, at the very least, a discursive terrain in which U.S. leaders, say that it's not the part of the United States to make military entanglements in Europe, to saying quite the opposite. What Truman says by the end of World War II, which is that we must relentlessly preserve our superiority in the land and on the sea and in the air. So there's been at least some sort of shift. Now, when we get to, if you want me to get to the post-war planning in World War II, then, I would make a bit of a stronger claim about the contingency of that moment.
Yeah, no, I think we're mostly in line post-war and during war. It's really the pre-war, I think. This could just be emphasis. It could even be just semantics. I'm not sure here. So let me see if I got you right. You are acknowledging that, at least rhetorically, many, if not most, of the sort of so-called foreign policy elite, dating back to the founders, are demonstrating a desire for a global empire headed by the United States. You see at least some rhetoric there. No?
Well, they don't say global empire. So a new world empire that will in some way provide inspiration eventually for the world.
Well, I mean, so John Adams said all the founders said that they were going to replace Britain as and Rome as they said that Britain replaced Rome, and then we are going to replace Britain as the global empire, world empire. I mean, world, global. I forget which words, but it was one of those. And then the Declaration of Independence. This is what I say to my libertarian friends who love to talk about natural rights all the time.
Yeah.
The Declaration of Independence says that this is, these things are natural God-given rights. Well, I've always said, well, if those rights are being abrogated by some dictator across the world, isn't it therefore, if you believe in this, isn't it therefore your obligation to do something about it? More than just sitting in your study in New York City or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco and talking about it. I think there's an injunction there inside of that. And no less than Charles Sumner, after the Civil War during Reconstruction, said this very thing. He said that the Declaration of Independence obligates us to go out into the world, in this case the southern states, which were now a different country, and remake them in our own image. And then Beveridge, certainly, is it Albert or Alfred? I always forget. Beveridge. Albert, yeah, the big senator during the late 19th century who was the big proponent for Spanish-American War. I mean, that guy was, talk about psycho. I mean, he was really going on, and it became a race war where the Anglo-Saxon race must rule all the savages. And Teddy Roosevelt, come on, I mean, these guys.
Teddy Roosevelt, totally, yeah. I mean, absolutely.
I've been telling you for many, many months now, the Paloma Verde CBD, a great company out of San Antonio, Texas, is the sponsor of Unregistered. And they still are, I'm very proud to say. But Carlos just called me on the phone, I'm not kidding you, about 5 minutes ago, and told me a whole new part of the story I wish I'd known before. I'm a little mad at him, actually. Carlos and his wife Vanessa own the store. They operate it independently as an entrepreneurial enterprise. Now, what happened was their fathers both suffered from chronic pain from lifetimes of manual labor. Carlos and Vanessa tried to convince them to use CBD. They resisted at first because it was a marijuana-related thing, but finally they were convinced. They used CBD and their pain was alleviated. So Carlos and Vanessa decided, because of this, they were inspired to spread the word and to distribute CBD to people who can really use it, who may not know about it. And so they did. They tried to open a brick and mortar store in San Antonio, Texas, but that was right before the pandemic hit. And the government lockdown made their brick and mortar store, as Carlos just told me, a huge waste of money because they couldn't get any customers there. So what did they do? They went online with their business. And largely because of Unregistered listeners, their company has thrived and prospered. It's a successful company largely because of us. It's one of the proudest things I can say. But they went to the banks back then to get a loan to be online, to have a store at all, and the bank said, no, we can't give you a loan because you're a marijuana-related business. They said, okay, we'll just take a bank account. The bank said no to that. They couldn't even get bank accounts because allegedly CBD is somehow illicit, even though it's perfectly legal, and there is no THC at all in their products. Carlos and Vanessa continued to persevere. They went online. They became a sponsor for us. I started to tell their story, and you started to buy their products. And I think you've been buying their products for a lot of reasons. One, Unregistered listeners are very sympathetic to a cause like that. I'm so proud of this. But also, we're not stupid. Carlos and Vanessa have been offering tremendous discounts on products that many of us were already buying. Try getting a 25% discount from some other place. That's what we get on every single product by going to palomaverdecbd.com and using the discount code RENEGADE. On top of that, if you just join their mailing list, you get another 10% off. And on top of that, Carlos and Vanessa, as I've been telling you for a long time, put together my 3 favorite Paloma Verde products into what is called the Unregistered Combo Pack, also known informally as the Thad Pack. And for that, you get 33% off. Here's what's in that pack. They're soft gels, 10 milligrams of CBD per soft gel. Oh my goodness, today was a rough day for me because of all sorts of stuff that was going on in the news and in my life. I think I used 5 of them today. Better days, it's like 2 or 3. Great maintenance of mental health with that one. They're gummies. Empty. There's a new delivery on the way from Carlos, thank God, but I go through these things really fast because they taste really good. Again, 10 milligrams per gummy. They come in sour apple and assorted fruit flavors. All delicious, as you can tell. My favorite thing, as I've said many times, that you get with the Thad Pack is their high potency tincture. You put some drops under your tongue, and for me, my anxiety and my insomnia melt away. So go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code Renegade, support a fantastic cause, and get a bunch of great products for a great deal. Make your life better, feel better, and I thank you.
But okay, let's take Teddy Roosevelt, who's a really good case for you, right? He breached the old world, new world dichotomy. He did not think in that way. So when he puts forward his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, yes, he's still saying that the United States should exercise international police power over the Western Hemisphere, but he's casting the United States as an instance of a Western civilized imperial power. And he was a huge admirer of the British Empire and wished that the United States could act more like the British Empire. In my reading, he found out that was hard to do. And the Philippines campaign became unpopular. And he was chagrined at that. But even he, in his presidency, is, mostly intervening in the greater Caribbean basin. And not, presenting the entire world as the United States' responsibility. Now, of course, he's for intervention in World War I, one of the key people. And I have no doubt that had he lived beyond 1919 and had he lived to, my period, he would have been one of the first to make the turn to global supremacy. So, again, he's a good case. But, even he is kind of flirting toward the ends of his life as Americans in World War I are debating what kind of peace settlement should follow the war. He is really interested in this legalistic conception for a League of Nations that the League to Enforce Peace put forward, whose president was William Howard Taft. I mean, FDR isn't the kind of hard legalist like these, but this position was really popular. And from our own time, this idea for U.S. participation in a world organization is totally unlike what could be said today. I mean, the idea was that states would have agreed to settle their disputes in an international court, and maybe the great powers would agree to enforce the rulings of the court or enforce submission of disputes to the court. There's this whole confidence that international law and tribunals, or what was called for the first 4 decades of the 20th century, the international settlement of disputes, was something that could fundamentally, secure world order and replace power politics, even if, of course, it justified, the exercise of greater power politics by the great powers. So, I'm totally with you in seeing, first of all, the imperialism. That's there for sure, but it's not the same thing as seeing a commitment to, participate in power politics, station American troops all around the world, and say it's the United States that has this responsibility to use force and equate the kind of presence of the United States in the world with the use of force. Indeed, what defined internationalism for Roosevelt's own generation, an imperialist generation to be sure, but what defined internationalism, that term to them, was the idea that somehow, in some way in the future, the system of power politics could be transcended by, liberal discussion, intercourse, international law, things like that. And that really falls apart big time in the interwar period, especially the 1930s with the rise of the totalitarian powers, and then World War II.
Okay, so you're reminding me of a lot of things, but so we haven't talked about this guy named Woodrow Wilson yet. You're reminding me of this great debate, which I used to teach at Columbia, between Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge about the League of Nations. And Henry Cabot Lodge, in one of his many speeches on this, rants and raves about the entanglements of the League of Nations, and we are too great a country to be held down by a relationship with these effeminate, debauched European powers. And I would ask my class at Columbia, what's Henry Cabot Lodge's position on foreign policy? And they'd be like, oh, he's an isolationist. And I'd be like, no, no, he's the first George W. Bush, actually. So it's, or not the first, he's one of many, actually, is what I'm saying. But no, his point was that the United States should go out and run the world on its own. We don't need a League of Nations or later a UN, right? That was the debate. And Wilson, although in your book, actually, you do say that Wilson was interested in having some kind of dominion over Europe, right? There's a couple paragraphs there where you're saying that about Wilson. So he was I hear you about the founding fathers in the 19th century, people being nervous about going into Europe, but I'm going to say these are the reasons why. The United States was lagging behind Britain in steel production until the early 20th century. The U.S. Navy was a tin can compared to the British Navy as of 1910, 1920. And I just thought of this. Another reason they couldn't act on what I see as their globalist, imperialist ambitions is that they had a population that was filling up with immigrants who had all these different cultures and languages and didn't know English, much less like that the United States should go conquer some damn country where they just came from. And so that whole process of assimilating the immigrants and making them into soldiers didn't happen until 1941, right? By 1941, you've got the Italians and the Jews and the Irish all ready to go as Americans and fight in Italy and across wherever they need to go, right? But that wasn't the case as of 1900, 1910, World War I. So Wilson had to do it with just the white boys from Kansas, and there weren't enough of them to have bases all over the world. But most importantly, it was the steel production and the Navy. I mean, they couldn't do it, even no matter how imperialist they were. If they were little Genghis Khans, they still couldn't have gotten into their ships and taken over. The Brits were there, blocking the way. Isn't that fair? I mean, a reasonable supposition as to why they didn't act on these things, these ideas?
I think that's reasonable, but then I have to ask, what were the ideas exactly at the time? So it's true that Republican opponents of Wilson in World War I were contemplating making a specific security guarantee to France and maybe Britain in the post-war world. And Wilson stood against that and wanted the United States to enter his general League of Nations. Mm-hmm. But, Wilson's argument was different from the argument of FDR later and the post-war planners around FDR. I mean, it's not, Wilson says that his League of Nations is supposed to be a disentangling alliance because he's under attack from Lodge and others who are making this traditional kind of argument that the United States should not enter into entangling alliances and wouldn't, U.S. entry into the League of Nations corrupt the United States, Europeanize America, and he argues that no, instead it will Americanize Europe.
Yeah.
Right. So, you want to call this an imperialist argument? I've got no objection to that, and it's an exceptionalist argument to be sure. I mean, Wilson, there's no greater American exceptionalist than Woodrow Wilson. So I'm not. This is not a brief for Woodrow Wilson. However, it's notable that Woodrow Wilson's argument is this is a disentangling alliance, and the popularity of his scheme for the League seems to hinge upon the idea that once the United States joins the League and the countries pledge in Article 10 and the other articles to protect each other, force won't actually have to be used. So there's this assumption, which I'm calling, internationalist. I think it defined transatlantic internationalism of the era, that there exists, this is what E.H. Carr basically writes about with different vocabulary. He calls it idealist. But there exists a latent harmony of interest in the world. It's not able to express itself. That's why we have war and power politics. And something has to happen in order to clear out the obstruction, to let the true opinion and interest of the people reign. And when that happens, you have something like perpetual peace. Okay? And so Woodrow Wilson himself says that what is really important about this League of Nations, what's really going to make it work, isn't the pledge of armed force. That's more of a symbol. The real thing will be the force, the moral force of public opinion. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't hear that these days, and I'm not nostalgic for that, but that's different. And I want to take this seriously. I mean, these people actually believed this stuff.
Yep.
And it was a really popular position in the United States, especially because not a whole lot of people wanted the United States to be engaging in a whole lot of wars over in Europe, especially after World War I in the 20s and the 30s.
It's funny. So Wilson, talk about megalomaniacs, but I agree. I like what you're saying here. There is a somewhat different vision. I get that he's not interested in rushing even World War I. I mean, the guy who did send the country into World War I, it took him a while, and at first he was opposed to it, at least formally and officially. We don't know what was in his heart. I kind of suspect he was interested, from the beginning. But it's true. It took him till 1917, for God's sake, up till the last minute. And here's a funny thing about him, Stephen. When I was researching him many years ago, of course, this was before I knew much, and I just was like, oh, Wilson, imperialist. So I just started Googling, trying to find him saying stuff, that's imperialistic, of course. And I was like, he must have said, we must Americanize the world. He must have used that word Americanize. Well, I couldn't find that. But what I did find was Woodrow Wilson saying, we must Christianize the world. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of jiving with your point just now, right? That it was a moralistic politics rather than a hard-headed realpolitik, right? At all. I mean, he was hoping, I guess it's a hope, isn't it? It's a hope that people will see. It's the city on a hill idea, right? We build it, the Pilgrims said, the Puritans said, we build this beautiful God's country here, and it's going to be so amazing. It'll serve as an example, and people around the world will emulate it. So we won't have to invade anybody, was the argument by John Winthrop.
Right.
Way back, right?
That's the ideal situation.
Yeah.
Never seems to happen.
And then, of course, no, you're right, exactly. The Indians kept just sitting on their damn land and not making anything out of it, and they kept occasionally attacking us, and, well, we're going to have to form a militia, which took them about 5 years, and then they started killing and going out and, conquering land all around them, and then didn't stop until they hit the Pacific Ocean, of course. But, well, they didn't stop then because then they went to Japan, but that's another story. But, yeah, okay. But it's still, my goodness, the visions, the motivations, the ambition, the identification with empire, global empire, is still there, isn't it? I mean,
sure. Okay. I mean, well, yes, but okay. So, if empire is a good thing, and you're Woodrow Wilson,
yeah.
Why should the United States shoulder all the burden of civilizing the barbarians, for example? So, Woodrow Wilson sits down with Jan Smuts and designs the League of Nations mandate system. Mm-hmm. And, it's not as though Woodrow Wilson, he did think about whether the United States might take a mandate in Armenia, which is interesting, but that did not happen, just as the security guarantee to France didn't happen. So even if you're an imperialist and you think it's terribly important to the structure of the world that there be imperial powers, it's not obvious that the United States should go out and take territories. It's hard to do that in the Western Hemisphere, where there are now internationally recognized states. And why shoulder the burdens? It's burdensome, it's costly, and it's controversial among the American public and the political system to do all of these things. And so I agree with you, especially coming out of World War I, there were increasing numbers of elites who were, discarding the traditional American aversion to the British Empire, especially from the 19th century, participating in efforts like the Round Table to think about Greater Britain and insert the United States into this Anglosphere. But that, again, doesn't mean the United States needs to be at the center of this. You could just let the British and French empires exert the burdens of, global leadership, imperial leadership, call it what you want, with the United States playing a lower-cost role, less risky role, mostly in its New World domain, at least when it came to the use and commitment of military force. And so that's an option that's quite appealing for the more interventionist-minded U.S. elites, and that's why, as late as 1939, the soon-to-be British ambassador to the United States, Lord Lothian, goes to FDR at the beginning of the year and says, take up the torch of world leadership from Great Britain, help us out, and just, FDR is not having it. You guys, he's not against the British leading, but he wants them to do it. He doesn't think the United States should supplant Britain at that point, or so I argue. Well, since you've gone down this road of taking ideas really seriously, let me return the favor and take material power seriously too. So you might argue that the reason why Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations didn't stick in World War I, and also the reason why the Republican Lodge schemes or the legalist League of Nations schemes didn't stick either, was simply that the United States did not have enough relative power to the European empires at that time. And so people did not imagine that Woodrow Wilson's argument was actually plausible, that the United States was somehow going to be the senior partner in this League of Nations arrangement, when, the British Empire was another feature, and the French, for that matter. And what I found in the 1940-41 period is that for the first time, it seems to me, it actually seemed to have happened that the United States was in a superior position to the British. The British were in deep trouble, and so the post-war planners working in the Council on Foreign Relations on behalf of the State Department and others elsewhere working in parallel come up with these ideas for exclusive, what they call American-British post-war leadership.
Yes.
And that's very intentional placement. They're actually using the term Anglo-American in 1940, and there's a switch by 1941, American-British.
Oh, wow.
Because they see that the United States now has the power and will be the senior partner. And even The Economist from London actually writes in the spring of 1941, come be the senior partner, help us out, and you can take the lead, and we're going to be deferential to you. So perhaps, if you want to give a materialist reading of the story, that's also pretty consistent with my chronology. You could say that because the United States was so economically dominant coming out of World War II, and for the first time clearly militarily dominant, now Americans could, give up their non-entanglement tradition, but on the assumption that the United States still wouldn't really be entangled if it took up the role of global policeman.
Okay, I think I agree with you. I pointed out the real material barriers to realizing these ambitions. They didn't have enough steel, enough battleships, and enough men who were identified as Americans yet to do this job of taking over the whole world.
Yeah,
Let's go to
I'm with you. I would just let me just put a pin in that. The one thing I would say is that the ideas kind of kept pace with the materiality. So,
okay,
I don't see Woodrow Wilson saying the exact same argument for American global primacy that we see today. So the ideas did change. Maybe they changed in tandem with the material reality. That's totally fair. But there has been a real shift, I think, in the ideas, and that comes out in the process of planning for the post-war, which now you want to turn to. So
we're going to turn to World War II, but I'm going to do something really sneaky and impolite. I'm going to tell you that when I teach my course on World War II at Renegade University, I begin in the 1880s. I believe the origin of World War II from the American side is in the 1880s. And that is with the publication of this guy we talked about earlier, Admiral Mahan's books, in which he says very clearly, Japan is a problem. Japan is the only power in the Pacific, which of course is a major trading zone. Whoever controls the Pacific is going to control much of the world. They are rising in power. They are building up their military and their industrial economy. We must take them out. A war between us and them is inevitable for both racial, he said, reasons and practical reasons. And those books became the books that every foreign policy elite person had to read, right? By the 1890s, everybody was reading them who had anything to do with American foreign policy, including, and here's a really important piece that I, again, discovered when I started researching this, the goddamn boarding schools, right? The elite boarding schools in the Northeast where every elite boy was trained in the 19th century and early 20th century, including, do you know about Groton, where FDR went as a high school student, right? Led by Endicott Peabody, who was the headmaster there. Groton School for Boys, it was called. FDR entered in 1896 and graduated in 1899 or 1900, went straight to Harvard. But at Groton, and there are books about this, they were shown maps of the world by the teachers. This is in the 19th century. Were shown maps of the world, and they were pointing out, this is Japan, they're a problem, we're going to have to go to war with them someday, and this is Europe, and who knows, we might have to go to war with them someday. But most importantly, boys, you and we are the best people on earth, and to keep our goodness within our borders is selfish. We have to not go out into the world and give the brown people everywhere, and even the poor white people in Europe, to not give them what we have is selfish, and it's a violation of God's order. He wants us to do this. And FDR loves that stuff. His mother gave him Mahan's books when he was like 15 years old. And the guy was sitting in his room at Groton in Massachusetts, like, he wrote letters about Japan when he was a teenager. Like, when FDR was a teenager, he was talking about going to war with Japan. And then he becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson in the 1910s, and he's a loose cannon. Like, they can't control the guy. They hated him. He was a real problem. He was constantly calling for war with Japan over any reason. He called for totally shutting off immigration from Japan because they were going to take over the West Coast by deliberately injecting their population here. But there was just like every opportunity he can take. And I'm talking about, Joseph S. Daniels, who was Wilson's defense or state, one of them, defense, right? And Wilson himself are known as like these great imperialists, of course. And they're looking at this guy coming out of Groton Academy, and Harvard, raring to go against Japan. He wasn't talking about Germany yet, but he was definitely interested in war with Japan. And then the last thing on this, his very first cabinet meeting in 1933, when he took office, very first cabinet meeting, and Rexford Tugwell, one of his main advisors, has written about this. The postmaster has written about this in memoirs. This is doubly sourced. FDR doesn't just talk about it. He lays on the table plans and maps for a war with Japan, including moving the Navy into the Pacific and moving the Air Force, into the Aleutian Islands and capturing islands and putting bases all over the Pacific to get ready. In 1933, as soon as he's in office, this first damn cabinet meeting. So I mean, what do you do with that? Like, how do you integrate that into your narrative, or do you? I mean, how can you?
Yeah, I mean, so one could say a lot of things. Yes, everybody read Mahan, but even a disciple of his, like Teddy Roosevelt, came to a different view of the Japanese. Roosevelt saw it very. He goes back and forth about this, but he saw Japan as a partner in the global imperial civilizing project.
Right.
And I'm personally a bit less interested in kind of reading the tea leaves on FDR, who is obviously an indispensable figure, than I am in looking at the kind of broader ferment of, best way to put it might be semi-officialdom, that not only were doing more of the long-range thinking and planning than FDR, certainly once he's in office, but also directly become, the so-called wise men who are at the center of American statecraft in the High Cold War. John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan are parts of the story. Dean Acheson, etc. FDR will eventually die, and I actually don't see him as being terribly interesting in the story, because he doesn't, once the war starts, he's got to do this whole dance with public opinion. He's a crafty, nothing if not a crafty, savvy politician. And so when it comes to, and again, doesn't have the time to kind of, he's also not a very systematic thinker. So it's really hard to read the tea leaves if you want to come up with what is FDR's vision for the post-war world. People have done it, and it's part of my story, yes. But like, why read those tea leaves when you've got all these experts gathered to do post-war planning directly, who are doing it with Rockefeller Foundation money on behalf of the State Department, and then after Pearl Harbor are transplanted into the State Department, and do have impacts on FDR and others in the administration. To me, there's a kind of a forest in the trees issue if we dwell too much on FDR as much as he matters.
Okay, let's actually do World War II now, and then in the course of this, I will convince you that FDR. I hear you. I hear you. I mean, he wasn't like the sharpest knife in the drawer. He wasn't a great intellectual, but he was smart enough. And my point is, it doesn't matter, because he was the commander-in-chief, and he was the most popular politician in American history at that point. So he could do whatever he wanted, pretty much. Well, certainly by 39, 40, he could in foreign policy. So I do think the guy's little ideas, and I do say this little. I mean, have you read his stuff on race and Jews in the 1920s? I mean, he was just like outrageously racist. Yeah. So. Yeah, but no. Anyway, so let's do World War II. So let's go 39 and 40. Let's talk about the pivotal years here. I place the big pivot toward full commitment, and we agree there was not full commitment, okay, to global imperialism. I'll give you that, okay. Because they couldn't yet, but now they could. At least they could see that it was. Even actually in 39, they still didn't have the Navy for it. They had to build the Navy.
No, they didn't.
That's right. But they could build it. They could build it, right? Because they had the factories, and then they also weren't at war. They weren't at war yet.
No, they could build it yet. I mean, it surprises people.
Well, they had the
when U.S. enormous industrial capacity, yes, but countries still recovering from the Great Depression. There's a huge question about the political will needed to assemble the coalition to actually actuate that industrial strength and turn it into military strength. So it is quite significant to these people when the U.S. actually begins to rearm and shows that it can rearm on a vast scale with popular support in 1940 and especially 41. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. No, I agree with all that. Very good points. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. As I said earlier, for me, the moment when they fully commit, materially, not just intellectually. To me, they'd always been intellectually committed. Finally, was 39. So you have the Council on Foreign Relations, which no one had heard of at that point. It was a fairly insignificant thing, although they'd been publishing articles for a decade in their journal, Foreign Affairs, right? And the big word, if you can Google this, you can just go to Foreign Affairs and just do a search in the 1930s for the word autarky. They were obsessed with autarky, which was national self-sufficiency. So countries cutting themselves off from international trade, which Germany was in the process of doing, right? For many reasons, because they didn't want foreign influence, and Jews were out there bringing in jazz and da-da-da-da-da. And Japan wasn't going there yet, but there was a powerful faction within the Japanese government that did want to go autarkic. And the guys at the Council on Foreign Relations on East 65th Street were, throughout the 30s, again, they were talking about this is a problem. The United States had to do something about it. The Council on Foreign Relations townhouse, their first headquarters there, do you know who their next door neighbor was?
I don't. Oh.
For 20 years, the next door neighbor, they shared a wall because it's townhomes, right, on East 65th Street. For 20 years, their neighbors were Eleanor and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They shared a wall with the Council on Foreign Relations.
I did not know that.
Yeah, no, it was a fun fact I found, which involved like some Google map searching because I was no longer living in New York, so I couldn't just go up there and look at it. But yeah. And so in 1939, Germany invades Poland in the fall, September 1st. And at that moment, they already had plans drawn up. They had been working on plans. And I think it was within 2 weeks or a week, as I said, they got on a train and went down to D.C. and met with the State Department. The State Department said, yes, you make all of our plans for the war and the outcome of the war, and get all your professors together. It was all professors for the most part, journalists, us. Every big war, I've always said, is the fault of some professor somewhere. It's always come out of the head of someone like us, Stephen, someone with a PhD, some professorial bastard. But it became the War and Peace Studies program. They said this must be kept secret throughout the war, and they did that. It was an actual conspiracy. It was an actual conspiracy, a secret conspiracy for 6 years. So why don't you? I think I've heard your argument in pieces, but put it all together right now against why that's the beginning.
So you're right, that the council men went down to D.C. right after the war broke out. They had lined up this Rockefeller Foundation money.
Yeah.
And they did see, as they said at the time, an opportunity for the United States to emerge as a major player after the war. But let's look at what they were doing in the period of the so-called phony war in Europe. From 1939 to the spring of 1940 through April.
Right.
So I looked at these documents. I went down to the council and the archives at Princeton. There's also, by the way, a smaller group of post-war planners in the State Department, actually, at this time, that worked in parallel. And they came to similar conclusions. So all of them pretty much agreed that it was undesirable and in any case basically inconceivable that the United States would commit itself militarily to Europe after the war, and they didn't anticipate that the United States would enter the war at this point. They were looking for ways of creating, economic relationships, trying to deal with different economic arrangements. But this is why Sumner Welles was dispatched, FDR's man in the department, the Undersecretary of State. He goes to Europe in the spring of 1940 seeking, as one newspaper at the time commented, peace without victory, the old Wilsonian internationalist formula. And at this point, the post-war planners in the State Department were planning to bring Mussolini's Italy to the side of the democracies in order to try and mediate a settlement in Europe, because they expected that the war in Europe would go roughly like the First World War, be very slow, it would be a stalemate. In any case, France had the strongest army in the world behind this fearsome Maginot Line. And so very few people expected the fate that befell France in just a period of 6 weeks in May and June of 1940, when the Nazis went around the Maginot Line and conquered France. And that really changed the equation for these planners. So I do see their own plans their calculations changing dramatically in this short span of time.
How about, instead of changing, will you allow me to say accelerating?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that they're adapting to circumstance, but there comes a time when adaptation to circumstance is such that it kind of produces something new.
Okay.
And so we can both kind of argue the same thing, but so, the group in the Council on Foreign Relations that deals, there were 4 of these groups within the War and Peace Studies group. Mm-hmm. The war that dealt with military affairs was headed by Hanson Baldwin, a New York Times military analyst,
a great journalist,
and Alan Dulles, future CIA director.
Right.
So on the eve of the Nazi invasion of France, they send a memo to the State Department, which is a catalog of schemes for disarmament that went back to the ancient Greeks, who had, according to them, prohibited poisoning wells, and went up to Winston Churchill in 1913, who proposed a 1-year holiday on naval building. And this is what they thought was like worth their time.
Huh.
Right, in March, April of 1940. And this is what arrives to the State Department at the beginning of May, as the Nazis are gearing up for their invasion of France. And this group, like the same people, have totally different plans a year later for the U.S. to join up in that American-British policing scheme and, have troops, pretty much anywhere in the world wherever the balance of power was threatened.
Okay.
So, if you want to, I think there has to be, like, it's a necessity in terms of causal explanation that there were pre-existing commitments that caused this change in planning and ideas. And I also don't think that it was like a coin flip between the non-interventionist position, the America First hemisphere position, mm-hmm. and the globalist, internationalist, interventionist position that prevails. I do think that, from the fall of 1940 onward, it's much more likely there's a more powerful constituency in favor of what becomes U.S. global dominance. So I don't think it was a fair fight exactly, mm-hmm. But it was really uncertain. And even these people who are the architects, laying out blueprints for U.S. military dominance, just 6 months, a year later, think it's worth their time, hearkening back to these old 19th century liberal internationalist formula of, mediation, arbitration, disarmament, and we hope to trade with as many people as possible.
Right. This might help. I agree with all that, or at least I have no argument against it. I'm sure there was some shift in the way they were thinking, and possibly in the ambitions themselves, based on facts on the ground changing so fast and so dramatically in 39 and 40. But here's the thing we haven't talked about, and I don't think you'll disagree with me on this. Our guy Adolf Burley, or Burl, however you want to pronounce it, the guy we mentioned earlier, he was one of the top advisors to FDR. He sort of had different titles. He kind of had it didn't really matter what his title was. He was just one of those sort of informal guys around FDR who filled his head with stuff. Burley was an interesting guy, another Columbia person, by the way. And they're all the, by the way, when I was teaching this survey at Columbia, the U.S. History Survey, it was remarkable how, like, every terrible event, the worst events in American history, there's some Columbia person behind them. Every one of them.
Oh, always, yes.
Isn't it amazing?
It's a proud legacy which we're trying to extend to this day.
I would say, like, only Vietnam, we give that to Harvard, but everything else is pretty much a Columbia job. Yeah. So Adolf Burley, I think it was it was 41, right at the beginning. It might have been right after Pearl Harbor, I'm not sure, but somewhere at the beginning. He says, look, we're going to take over, I think, from Britain as the global hegemon. However, here's the thing. We don't do colonialism. That's not American. We don't like that. This is going to be and he called, I think he actually said this is a new kind of imperialism. I think he actually used the word of managed trade, because we're going to be the dominant power economically. We know that really soon. And so if we have a system, a world system where all the borders are open, where all the countries are open for business, unlike Germany, who has to be, that's why they, by the way, they went to war with Germany, to open trade, to make sure that whole block in Eastern Europe was like open for trade. And Japan and the Pacific, we need to make sure we have the China market in our back pocket, right? Because if we, in any sort of relatively equal, formally equal trading relationship, we're going to win because we're the rich guys.
Right.
And we're going to be, at the end of the war, we're going to be not just the rich guys, but the rich guys with bigger guns. So managed trade and a military presence, but not direct control over territories, the way that the Brits did it, the way that the Romans did it. This is what, right? Is this not the plan that they came up with?
So, okay, so it matters exactly when he's thinking, if you buy my argument, right? Is it 1941? Is it 1940? And when? But look, there's no question. What you are describing sounds like it goes back to this tradition of the open door notes. And, the British Empire, in fact, it's costly to actually do formal empire. If you can get what you want without doing it, that's the best. And so the United States was in an incredibly luxurious position, including in World War II. That's why it could get together all these post-war planners, as no other country could have such an advanced post-war planning operation. Even the British didn't manage to do that in 1940 and 41. They're fighting for their survival. The United States was not fighting for its survival.
Right.
So even the planners who, in 1941, were taking the British Empire quite directly as a model for U.S. or American British post-war policing, yes, they didn't want the United States to be a formal colonial power by and large. What is the point of that? It's better to prop up the British imperial structure and benefit from trade, and sure, have the kind of lightest, least costly military bootprint that they want. At the same time, they were using the British imperial policing of Iraq and the northwest frontier province of India in 1941 as a model for this kind of, what we would call today low-intensity conflict, where, they were hoping you could have aerial bombing, where the U.S. could achieve its objectives, discipline states that might be formally sovereign states, and nip any aggressors in the bud. So there's a selective use of the British model, including there's a lot of attraction to the British Commonwealth also as this entity, which included the white settler dominions as a basis for how the U.S. would try to order the world, because here was a community of Anglophone countries united in the minds of these planners by a kind of commonality of interest and sentiment, by which some of them meant race and some of them actually said race. And there wasn't like formal obligations, binding these different polities to defend each other. So they were trying to come up with an alternative to the failed League of Nations scheme. And so for a while, there's this intense interest in the United States joining, maybe formally, maybe a bit informally, with the British Commonwealth to police the post-war world. That's the main idea coming out of the Council on Foreign Relations planners through most of 1941.
Yeah.
It excluded the Soviet Union at this point. It excluded other potential allied powers from the post-war arrangement.
Okay. Good. I didn't know that. So it was kind of a mixed model of imperialism, right? It was both the old colonialist style and this new managerial, for lack of a better word, style or approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I would say at this particular moment, maybe the way I'd put it is that the thinking was empire adjacent. Given the scale of what was envisioned and the widespread use of force that was envisioned, these elites couldn't help but think with empire as something of a model for what the United States would do, even if they would then insist, oh, we're not going to be quite like that, or we're not going to be exploitative. It's not going to be exactly the British Empire 2.0. So they couldn't help but invoke empire. So like even Henry Luce, who writes this American Century essay in February of 1941, this part isn't in private, this is in the most popular Life magazine, the most popular magazine that there was at the time.
It was Time.
It was in Time. Okay.
Yeah.
We had Time, Life, and Fortune. So he, talks about the United States taking over, inheriting the kind of British role from the 19th century and the early 20th century. He even goes so far as to say that, as he puts it, tyranny will require great living space, but freedom will require far greater living space than tyranny. So put aside for a minute the kind of identification with the British imperial or world ordering project. Luce openly, situates the United States in this relationship to Hitler's empire, and says, Hitler wants Lebensraum, we need even more. That's quite shocking. And, like Marco Rubio ran in 2016 on the slogan of something American Century. And of course, there's the Project for the New American Century thing that was launched by neoconservatives in the late 1990s. Right. So it's like a perfectly fine thing to be a major politician and talk about the American century. Well, this is the American century that they're talking about.
Yeah, so that's the title of Luce's essay. It's a very famous essay. So he says the 20th century, and this is the title, will be the American century, or is becoming the American century, which is, that's a global empire, right? It's funny, that, just sort of an aside, that essay never made any sense to me, though. Other than that, it's sort of garbled. I don't quite get it. And so it's not, I've never used it. I've wanted to use it, but I've just looked at it like 3 times of like, I don't really make heads or tails of this. My advisor, Alan Brinkley at Columbia, great man, recently passed away, wrote a whole biography of Henry Luce. And so he did know a thing or two about that. But, this is a question for you. Off topic, but I think it's really important. Not off topic entirely. The uses of the terms empire and imperialism, right? Which you alluded to. So no one was ashamed to use those terms until World War II. And then after this is the question. When is it just World War II that they stopped using those terms?
Empire?
And imperialism. Politicians in my whole lifetime, since the 1960s, have never used those terms favorably, or even at all. They don't mention it, right? But if you look at, it's funny as hell to look at like foreign policy elites before the 1940s, imperialism, empire, American empire, it's fine. But they become ashamed of it at a certain point. Is it the 40s? Do you know?
That's a great question. I don't exactly know. It was not, I will say that, most of the explicit empire talk happens in my narrative, that is to say, in World War II, behind closed doors. And so, I would say the term empire has a negative valence at that point. And, there are some really powerful anti-imperialist critiques in the 20s and 30s. In fact, some of the figures who I have converting to U.S. Global supremacy in the course of World War II were, kind of establishment figures. The research director of the Foreign Policy Association, for example, was, criticizing what he called American imperialism in Latin America in the 20s. This was okay. You could criticize American imperialism. I think imperialism always had a kind of negative connotation. My sense is empire was more flexible.
Yeah. It's the old way of doing things. We're Americans. It's the old European way of doing. That's what Adolf Berle was basically saying. But he wasn't making just sort of an aesthetic point. He was saying that empire has become quite unpopular around the world the way the Brits have been going about it. So let's not make that mistake. And it was two mistakes. Number one, a lot of the people in those countries don't like us now and might go to war with us. And number two is we have all these dusky hordes of people floating ashore now, coming from those places, because empires, the anti-imperialist racists of the 19th century said, also serve as bridges, which is the last thing we want. We don't want bridges to Africa and bridges to the Philippines, for God's sake. So the segregationist, racist senators, U.S. senators in the 1890s were like, hell no, we're not going to war in those places because we don't want to have anything to do with those darkies, is exactly how they talked. Anyway, let's go back to World War II. So 41, we have, in 41, we have in January, Hitler gives his last so-called prophecy speech, which he gave annually for about 5 years, in which he would get up in the Reichstag, I think it was always January, and give this speech to the whole world in front of all the cameras saying, hey, now the thing is about Hitler, big talker. So like very long speeches, very sort of florid rhetoric, but it's in there. You just had to listen or read it. He said, we've got the Jews. We haven't killed them because they hadn't started killing them. There was no Holocaust. There wasn't even plans for it. There was no thinking about the Holocaust in the 30s. But he says, but if you stop us from getting what is rightfully ours, meaning what was taken from Germany by the Versailles Treaty and Poland and Western Russia, which Hitler and the Nazis believed belonged to Germans because they were Teutonic originally, blah, blah, blah. If you get in our way of doing that, then we're going to kill them. He said that every year, for years and years, prophecy speeches. And he also said by 41, he was offering to deliver all the Jews of the Third Reich on German ships directly to whichever country would take them. They would ask and demand, they would plead with the West, you keep saying you love these Jews, take them, we'll give them to you on our own boats. And of course, what did the United States and all the allies do? They closed their borders entirely, especially to Jewish refugees. The State Department was rife with anti-Semites, and they did not want this. We know this is somewhat well known, but it's one of the more outrageous things. So what happens is they invade Poland. They do kill Jews, but that was not the purpose. It was mostly to kill the Poles and to take over Poland. And in fact, the top leadership in the Nazi regime they were pissed off when there were like pogroms against Jews at that time, because they wanted to do it in an orderly way. They were anti-Semites of reason, not anti-Semites of emotion. That's what Hitler did. He said the Russians, those idiots, they tried to kill the Jews by these spasms of pogroms, which didn't do the job, because look what happened. They had a Bolshevik revolution run by Jews, right? We're going to do it. We're going to line them up and make them walk out of the country. But 41 finally comes around. You know, he's been saying, look, if you stop us, if you military intervene against us with your military, we're going to kill them. We'll give them to you. The West says no. The West intervenes militarily big time, both the U.S. and Britain by this point. And so the day after Pearl Harbor, the day after the United States declared war on Germany, is the first gassing of Jews in Chelmno in Poland. The Holocaust begins the day after the United States formally enters the war. It's like, so U.S. policy during this time guaranteed, it didn't cause the Holocaust, but I would say it guaranteed its fulfillment, its realization.
There had been mass killings of Jews accompanied by Operation Barbarossa prior to Pearl Harbor, correct?
Correct. That's what I meant. Yeah. So, but that was not the elite. The Nazi in Berlin, the leadership. This is according to Christopher Browning. This is according to I think Ian Kershaw too. No, they did not want that. They didn't like it. There were lower level Nazi officers who definitely, if they had a pistol and they saw some Jew, they would just shoot him in the head. They would get punished often for that, because the idea was to take over Poland, not to get your jollies out of your inner sadism here against Jews. So that's the untold story of the Holocaust that I'm busy telling right now with my book that's coming out.
A couple of things I just want to say. I mean, one, sure. I think will be obvious. the people who favored intervention in World War II in the United States prior to Pearl Harbor were not trying to save the Jews of Europe.
No.
And the fact that the Roosevelt administration wasn't interested in taking in Jewish refugees from Europe during the war is a testimony to that. And so I know that, there's a kind of popular narrative of, internationalism versus isolationism. That's how, most Americans narrate this basic story. And the isolationists, are supposed to be like crypto-fascist and, driven by anti-Semitism, and the interventionists are, the cosmopolitans and everything else. Okay. Well, it's FDR who doesn't want to let the fleeing Jewish refugees in to save their lives. And those who wanted to intervene in the war simply were not, this is just not in the documents on post-war planning.
Right.
They don't care, unfortunately. So there's the country was very anti-Semitic. There's anti-Semitism in lots of different places. There's no neat story about this. Right. And the non-interventionists, Lindbergh was an anti-Semite. He made anti-Semitic speeches. It is notable that when he made an anti-Semitic speech toward the end of 1941, it brought disrepute upon the America First movement. The movement, lost popularity as a result of that, didn't gain. So, I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to represent what I think was really actuating these positions. It wasn't concern about a possible or actual Holocaust, and it wasn't, like being pro-Nazi. There were very few Americans who were pro-Nazi or something like that.
Right. We agree. You said you had two things to say. Was that two?
I don't know. If you could divide them up, then you could call them two. I don't know.
Well, I agreed with everything, so it was great. So let's go back. So to the narrative. All right. So 41, Pearl Harbor. They start gassing Jews the day after. People can look it up. Chelmno. I think it's spelled C-H-E. It's weird. It's like a Polish Chemlno in Poland. The first gassing. It's on the record. This is not disputed. Then and then the Wannsee conference happens in February. So that's 3 months later, and that's when they came up with the plans for the final solution and the idea of the final solution, and that's when they actually put it in. But it was the U.S. entry into World War II that really, I say, guaranteed the realization of the Holocaust. Thank you, FDR. But anyway, so your argument. So 42 comes along, and the United States is in the war. They're getting their ass kicked by Japan in the Pacific at this point. They have not entered the European theater yet. They have to build the military to win the war. They certainly have the capability, the capacity to do that. But what happens to the thinking? And this is where I definitely defer to you. You know this stuff definitely better than I do. What happens in the thinking in 42 after the fall of the Western Europe and all that?
Yeah. So one thing is that the Council on Foreign Relations planners, because now post-war planning can actually officially happen. Now that the United States is officially in the war, many of them get transplanted into the State Department, so they become the backbone of the official post-war planners of the U.S. government. So these guys start sitting around. Lots of interesting stuff, incidentally, there about really grotesque things about population transfer. I mean, some of them comment to each other how the Nazis have gotten the world used to forced population transfers, and now perhaps this is something that can be practiced after the war. Yeah, I mean I don't know. I think maybe I make a passing reference to that in my book. It's a little bit at a slant to what I'm interested in, but the records are kind of startling on that score. But what struck me in the archives is that these planners had reacted harshly against their old commitment to internationalism, this old naive notion that there was some kind of harmony out there that could bring about peace and world order. Now they were committed to the idea, precisely because that old kind of internationalism had failed, that the United States had to be the enforcer of international law and order in principle on a global scale. But they really start to worry. So in August of 1941, FDR and Churchill make this declaration, the 8 points in an echo of Wilson's 14. We know it as the Atlantic Charter. And it's pretty clear that they're anticipating an exclusive Anglo-American, policing of the seas. Other members of the administration are saying this in public as well. And the documents from the CFR planners also confirm it. This is very much the thought. And so these same planners, though, monitor the reaction to the Atlantic Charter. And what they conclude is that the charter fell like a dead duck, in their phrase, upon the American public and Congress. Even somebody like John Foster Dulles actually reacted against the Atlantic Charter, Cold Warrior Secretary of State, and said this is a recipe for Anglo-Saxon military and economic hegemony. And so these, yes. So that's very interesting, right? Still,
Dulles.
These people
Dulles said this?
Dulles says this.
Wow. Okay.
So, yeah. So the planners get really concerned about the optics of what they've been planning. They are worried that there's this resource in the country, especially popular amongst the public, which they are coming to represent as isolationism, this new term. But that's a pejorative. What they're referring to is something real, but it is this kind of American and liberal desire to stay out of power politics or transcend power politics. Okay. And on this basis, they fear the American people are going to reject these ideas to shoulder the burdens of world leadership or act like an empire. And so they really start to worry if it's just the United States and Britain, perhaps the whole thing will fall flat. And so in the middle of this war that the United States has just officially entered into against Japan in the Far East, starting to figure out how to take on the Nazis in Europe, the Soviet Union is fighting for its life in early 1942. The planners in the State Department have a huge preoccupation with the American public. They are worried that the American public is going to revert to their so-called traditional isolationism, and all these plans for U.S. Dominance after the war aren't going to be realized. And so that kind of gets me into the second part of my story, which is, there's this conception of American military hegemony worked out. Then the question to many of these elites becomes how to sell this, essentially, to yes, the world, but especially the American public, and elevate American military dominance into the axiomatic status that we have today. And I think this is achieved more or less by 1945. And it's achieved by developing this new set of concepts to understand, to portray America's role in the world. Now the choice will be represented as internationalism, meaning military dominance, or isolationism, which isn't a choice at all. It's a question of, do we participate in the world, which is equated with dominating it, or do we give in to those who would have us stay out of everything, as if that was ever on the table by any significant portion of Americans? So getting back to 1942, in the spring of 1942, there's this other decision that's made that surprised me in the archives, which is a decision to create what becomes the United Nations organization, to create a new world organization with every state a member, which was not at all an obvious thing to do. Because
this was in 42. They were losing the war in the Pacific. This is quite ambitious, right? And quite optimistic, right?
Yes, it's really bizarre, the degree of optimism, but I guess it's borne out in a way by what followed.
That's right.
But certainly in its own time, incredibly ambitious.
Yeah.
And so there's this decision made. The planners don't even know what exactly this world organization will do. The point is that there'll be something. And they work out the details later. But the point of the something is that through this world body, the United States will be able to reclaim the mantle of internationalism and make armed dominance like the epitome of internationalism. So now, positioned against isolationism, internationalism can mean dominating power politics and transcending it at the same time.
Through something that looks like the UN.
Right. Because the United States, this is why the United States, with its world leadership, will be different from, nasty British imperialism, let alone, the Axis New Order. The United States will be working in tandem with the world, with the international community. There will be participation by all, even as the planners, including Sumner Welles, speak really pejoratively about the other members of this world organization. They talk about what becomes the General Assembly as a forum for small states to blow off steam.
Yeah. Right. So what you're saying is the UN is a fraud.
I'm saying that the UN
it's a what is it? It's a Trojan horse for American superiority or something, or supremacy. Like it's something like that, right?
I'm not even opposed to the UN exactly, but I think we should see it for what it is. And there's a reason why the architects of U.S. military dominance also wanted to create the United Nations organization. They thought it was going to be an important vehicle for the United States to project power. And yes, there might be some constraining nature to it, but it was pretty minimal. I mean, it wasn't, even the League of Nations required states to take certain kinds of actions to defend territorial integrity. This was just a kind of basic, great powers can talk, they can decide to do something, they don't have to really decide to do anything if they don't want to. It was really minimal. So even at the time, there's this massive campaign that American elites undertake to rally the country around the UN, and they're really nervous about this. There's only 2 votes in the Senate against UN participation because it doesn't really obligate the United States to do much. Right. So at the time, it's evaluated as the symbol of American world leadership.
Hold on a second here. I'm thinking, how would you have voted at that moment, knowing what you know now?
On the UN?
Yeah. You vote no.
You've already lost, but it doesn't matter.
You vote but you vote no because
I think
if you're an anti-imperialist, even you vote no on the UN, which is funny, right? Because you think of it as like the great anti-imperialist body in the world, right? But no, it was a vehicle for American empire, as you said. That was your word.
It did become a forum where post-colonial states rallied, and I do think, I think we're better off with the UN today than without it, but it is really important that we understand that the UN, if you're against imperial power and you want to constrain hegemonic power, the UN is a very weak instrument, whereas it also provides an incredibly valuable resource for the strong to do what they want and give it a certain legitimacy. So as long as we understand that, I'm kind of okay with the UN.
As long as you know what's going on, you're okay with it.
Correct.
I mean, yeah, okay. I'm with you. We'll get into like current politics after we finish killing 65 million people. We have to finish the story of World War II here. So, by the way, that number, I know I would begin my lectures on World War II, the beginning of the World War II section, just by having the students just like sit with the numbers, just because they're so immense, and there's never been numbers like that in world history. Even World War I is, as immense as that was, it was still a fraction. And try to imagine like how many people that is. So the current estimates are about 65 million people died as a result of World War II. And it's like, I imagine like being in an airplane, right? And you would have to fly over, if you flew over, 1/5 of the United States, something like that. Take 1/5 the United States, like all of California, right, and more, and fly over every block in your helicopter or whatever plane, and just look at all those people, like waves after waves after waves, and all dead. And then just imagine them all dead. It's just, it's beyond staggering. It's such a large number that the human mind, I don't think, can really comprehend it. But
Yeah.
I am arguing in the book that I'm writing that the United States is directly responsible for a good maybe half to 2/3 of that number. That what were regional wars in China and Japan and in Germany and Poland turned into a world war, and they didn't have to. And also the Holocaust, as I said, happened as a result, in large part because of the United States entry into the war. But we can talk about that some other time. But so, okay, the UN, they conceive of the idea of something that becomes the UN in 42. And then where do their ambitions go as they start to win the war in 43, when the war turns?
So they start to create this new world organization. FDR, here's where FDR does play a significant role in my story. He's thinking for a while, just in terms of the big two, the US and the UK, that expands to include great powers. He has to be convinced by the post-war planners in the person of Sumner Welles to do a universal organization at all. And he readily gets the argument once he sees what this body will be, that it's not a do-over of the League of Nations. Actually, it's been designed against the League of Nations model, if anything. Sure. And so, my story actually, at this point, I'm really interested in how, coming out of the war, the United States has developed this at least symbolic commitment to a form of internationalism that opposes itself to isolationism, and thus provides an incredibly powerful formula for the United States to justify the projection of its power on a global scale. And so, there's always a temptation in our politics ever since, and in a lot of scholarship, to go back to this original moment of U.S. world leadership coming out of 1945. It's the good war, and it's the good world leadership. And, that's a response for many liberals to the George W. Bush administration. Now we're in a presidential race where, one candidate pines for, the kind of toughness of the middle of the 20th century from Generals Patton and MacArthur. That's Trump, his go-to generals. I think that's what he thought Mattis was going to be or something. Then you've got Joe Biden and a lot of the kind of foreign policy elites around him, or broadly sharing his worldview, that are calling for a return to the tried and true path of the liberal international order that began somewhere around 1945. But I think my conclusion is, that's not going to solve any of our problems today. And in fact, our problems today were bound up in the very project of perpetual U.S. military dominance, including the weak T of the United Nations as it stood in 1945. And I show that there were some of the people who designed the UN, were doing that, and also saying to themselves, yeah, but, if we want to use force and we don't get the approval of the Security Council, we'll do that anyway, right? It's yes. So, the idea that, and the scholar John Eikenberry is a distinguished proponent of this idea that, really U.S. world leadership was different from the others because the United States, at the end of the day, wanted to create a world of rules, not to rule the world. I just do not see that in, he's got a better case for the League of Nations, still not a great case, but a better case for that previous generation. But, as of 1945, that generation is reacting against what they see as the naive belief in rules and norms and public opinion of the previous generation. That's the whole point of U.S. military dominance for them.
This is why I call it managerial imperialism, because I agree with both of you or something, I guess. I mean, Eikenberry's right in that the United States as you know, was very interested in establishing rules, and it did. It established a whole bunch of rules, right? The GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That established this whole like framework for something that never existed before. Lots of rules about how to trade between countries, right?
Right.
But you and I agree that from the beginning, of course, I would say this, they had it always in mind that they would be the player in the game with the most pieces, the most monopoly money, so they would win the game. So why, Stephen, do you think that the American empire is bad?
Well, I don't like the sound of empire to begin with. In terms of a fight against the Axis powers, I don't have a problem with that. In terms of counterbalancing Soviet-backed communism, my answer is not no to that. Now, a whole lot of terrible things were done. Could the Cold War itself have been avoided with better statesmanship? Perhaps we can debate. I think we can have an argument about, how over the course of the Cold War, perhaps the United States did a good turn to Western Europe and Japan and Northeast Asia, and did really bad things to the global South, which is most of humanity. Mm-hmm. Millions died. Mm-hmm. We can debate the effects on America itself and on American society. But I think, so we can have all those good debates. But when we come to our own era, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've had 3 decades now. And this legacy, this commitment to military dominance, I think has served us incredibly poorly. However you could debate, I think there was a coherent rationale for American dominance previously. I think it was coherent. And I think it had some valuable results, right? I really don't credit it with that in our own time, in the 3-decade period following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The whole argument, to begin with, hinged on the assumption that totalitarian power was something that had to be repelled and prevented from expanding. Otherwise, it would keep expanding, and it would corrupt free intercourse, free exchange, the good things that Americans pretty much agreed that they wanted. But in our own time, what is the power that is trying to dominate the world by force, sanctioning dozens of countries, and launching endless military campaigns across a good arc of the world? I mean, if there's any dominant power acting, aggressively, it would be the United States in the last 3 decades. And so my view is that something else changed once the conditions in the world changed and expansive totalitarianism disappeared, which is that U.S. armed dominance, it makes sense that it continued because it was always conceived as a kind of perpetual project, but it has become something like an end unto itself. There's not really a good worked out theory of the case given the conditions of our world, of the 21st century world. And so the question of China then looms large as, something that could be seen as a totalitarian force that could give a new purpose to American global dominance.
Okay, so what I'm doing right now, I am channeling William F. Buckley. When I was about 19 or 20 years old in college and a big activist and a socialist and a big anti-imperialist, and I was opposed to all the wars, I was opposed to everything. And I watched William F. Buckley's firing line one night, and he was debating, I don't know who, but somebody who was arguing against the U.S. empire, the U.S. interventions in Vietnam. I forget which era it was from, but, just an anti-imperialist, right? And I just remember Buckley sitting back and saying, well, what do you have to say about the 42 divisions of the Red Army? that are waiting for us. What do you have to say about the millions of Soviets in uniform, right? And I was like, oh shit, right, god damn, they do have a really huge army, military, air force, everything, and nukes and the rest of it. And now they are in, Cuba and Vietnam and all across Africa and Central America eventually. And I mean, I'm on the opposite side of this, right? But like, I think we need to take those guys seriously if we're going to win this stuff. And since you're part of a think tank that's doing just this, I think it's a useful exercise. I had somebody on the show who was a big lefty anti-imperialist, and the last half hour of the show, I actually literally impersonated Robert Kagan, the neocon intellectual, who's kind of the big neocon intellectual. And I made neocon arguments, and he didn't know what to do with them, because they're very powerful if you're not used to confronting those arguments, right?
Yeah.
So here's an argument. Okay, so the world is, in fact, as of the 1940s, was full of autarkic nations that didn't want to trade with people, right? Germany and Japan, and there were others too who wanted to close off their borders to everything, people and trade and everything. Well, I mean, and Japan, certainly, they never had a global imperial ambition, but they did, in fact, have an Asiatic imperial ambition. They did talk. Yes. There were many people in Japan who talked about taking all of Asia from India to Mongolia and all the way to the east, right? For sure. Germany, everyone agrees that Hitler wanted at least Eastern Europe. There's only a disagreement about if he wanted more than that, but it's a lot.
Right.
That's a big chunk, and that's a lot of industry under his control, right? Mm-hmm. And could there have been, if he were successful, could there have been other leaders in the world who would emulate him? Quite possibly. I'm saying this as someone who's arguing that the U.S. was equally responsible for the Holocaust, okay? But I do think that the counter arguments are still powerful. Like, so you have communists, you have fascists. We all agree these are no good. Everybody, in this debate, no one likes those people. No one wants to live under those regimes, right? But they were, in fact, in the 1940s expanding, and then one of the regimes that survived continued to expand after the 40s, after World War II. We've had seas, oceans that have been basically open to trade throughout this period. This is what the big liberal internationalists will say to you and me, right? We have had relative peace. It's true. Like Steven Pinker will tell us this all the time, right? That the last 60 years has been, it's true, just statistically, more peaceful than any other era in modern history, I suppose, or whatever. But there hasn't been a world war since 1945. There hasn't been a world war. The worst thing that's ever happened to human beings has not happened since 1945. Is that just a coincidence, right? Or is that because the United States has exerted the kind of power it has? I don't know. I mean, like, in the back of my mind always, and dude, I've been an anti-imperialist since I was born. Yeah. So like, that stuff nonetheless haunts me. We can't prove it, right? We can't prove it's, correspondence and correlation or whatever. Correlation and causation. But it sure looks like it. It sure looks like the U.S. empire has had something to do with the fact that we've had relative peace, and it's been relatively easy to trade in in the last 70 or so years. What do you say to all that?
I think I can recognize a lot of truth in that. Okay. To be honest with you. And the interventionist position that I represent in the book, I am critical of it, but I'm not unmoved by it. I mean, I don't want to see the Nazis consolidate rule in Europe. I'm not sure they would have.
Right.
I mean, but nevertheless, it's partly for presentist reasons, I want to prevent and stop the Holocaust from happening, but that wasn't what was motivating the actors at the time. So that's really important to understand. So, this does speak to me, and this is why I'm not like a thoroughgoing anti-imperialist, because I do think, the hawks or the advocates of U.S. global dominance have a point when they say, so what is the alternative, right? But here's what I would say. It was pretty well understood by interventionists in the mid-20th century that U.S. safety and prosperity were not really on the line. They were doing this for other reasons, which they articulated in really vague terms. That's why they had trouble winning the argument at first, right? In terms of, we don't want world order to go a certain way. We don't want the United States to end up isolated in a hostile world, meaning dominant only in the Western Hemisphere, a very large part of the world. But nevertheless, the terms of history would be against the United States. The United States would not be generating history. And so, given the depravity of the Axis powers and the Soviet Union, I think you can have a perfectly fine searching debate about this question. Okay? But I think we can concede all of this. have all of it. Take World War II, take the entire Cold War as a good thing, as a great thing, if you really want to. Right?
Go full John McCain.
Yeah, okay. Be John McCain up to 1991. I don't get it after 1991. I don't get it. Okay? And that's what speaks most powerfully to our own circumstances today.
Very good point, Professor Wertheim. Yes, what I say in response to those arguments is that look inside those regimes, the Nazi regime and the Soviet regime. So, the Nazis, right? They didn't like Jews. So as soon as they took power, they barred Jews from holding any profession. Well, here's the problem, dumbasses. Jews dominate some very important professions, like namely the medical profession. So something like half the doctors in Berlin in 1939 were Jewish. And in 1940, there were no Jewish doctors. And consequently, like illness, disease, injuries, everything spikes. Jewish doctors dominated the study and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases. They pioneered it in Germany, in fact. This was like revolutionary scientists doing this stuff. They basically were curing gonorrhea for the first time. They all got fired and sent to camps eventually. Well, guess what happens, right? The penises of all the German men are falling off because of this very soon. I mean, spikes and gonorrhea, syphilis, all of it, right? The average height of German children declines in the 1930s. The children in every other European country, including poor-ass Portugal and Spain, their heights are rising through the 30s. Fascism, Nazism, literally starved its own people. This is before the war starts. This is before they're fighting, right? And then they got to go fight to conquer territory to get natural resources to feed the military that they need to da-da-da-da. It's the snake eating its own tail. It is the most absurd, self-destructive regime I think that's ever existed, certainly in modern history. It's the dumbest way to take and hold power. And the only reason I think that Hitler held on was, in fact, because of the West, because of what the West did in World War I and after, and because of the interventions in the late 30s and early 40s, right? There was an enemy. And then Britain starts bombing them before Germany did anything to Britain. So they have a real enemy who's killing our neighbors. And then communism, we don't really need to get into because we all know that shit did not work and that the writing was on the wall. And George Kennan called it in 1947. He said, just put a wall around them and let them be. They will collapse on their own because they're like dumb, weird children. He kind of described them that way, right? Like psychotic. He called them psychotic, I think, in fact, right? I think he used that word. But they don't have their act together. The whole system's going to collapse. And lo and behold, in 1991, as you just said, so Nazism gets killed literally in 1945. And 1991, communism collapses on its own. No revolution, no bullets fired, except in Romania. Just people literally walking away from their jobs in the factory, literally walking away from their posts in the Red Army, right? And the whole thing's down. Now, okay. So that's my argument against the American empire from 45 to 91. Now, you and I are totally in agreement. Since 91, Joe Biden, what the fuck are you talking about? I know there's going to be some professors watching this. I hope this didn't hurt their tender little minds, language like that and the politics of that. But yeah, I mean, the Clintons, what's up in the 1990s? What's happening, Bill and Hillary? And no one talks about this. This is like one of the most important decisions ever made, I would say, in the White House. It was like ongoing decision, but throughout the Clinton administration, they were like, no, I know, we know the communists are all dead and gone, but we still need this thing called NATO. Not only do we need it, we're going to extend it all the way up to the border of Russia.
Yeah.
Craziness. And don't they want to eventually extend it around to the southern border too? Isn't that part of the reason we're in Afghanistan? Right. This is Clintons. This is Hillary, who just ran for president, and her buddy Biden is now running for president. It's the Democratic Party. The Republicans, I just think, are dumb Democrats. They just don't do a good job of it. They were John McCain was he just wanted to fight. And like national pride was really important, but he didn't have like this like developed Wilsonian ideology that the Clintons have, that Wilson had, that FDR had, that all these people had. He wasn't smart enough, frankly. Like I don't think he ever had like this vision of Pax Americana and all this stuff. He just wanted to go fight people and kill the bad guys because they tortured him for so long in that fucking prison in Hanoi. But I don't know. Since 91, so what? This is to me like. It's just like, this is when they've gone psycho again. Like there is no enemy for, that was the reason for NATO's creation. But we still have, not only do we have NATO, but we have a bigger NATO and a stronger NATO and many, many more countries added to it.
Yeah.
So what's in their heads? I mean, tell me about the Clintons. What do you think?
Well, to be fair, planners in the Pentagon in the George H.W. Bush administration were foreseeing a new era of American primacy. Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, that crew.
You're talking about Bush 1. You're talking about
Bush 1.
Bush
1, yes. So, it's lest we pin too much on the Clintons today. I do think there's a shift that... So, I think the tragedy of the 1990s, first of all, the United States inherits this commitment to global dominance that, of course, it thinks it's validated by the Soviet collapse. But, the Soviet collapse means it's lost, as compelling a rationale as it can have. And there's really not, so far as I am aware, a real, robust debate in administrations or, outside of administrations about, the United States can now reap a massive peace dividend. The phrase peace dividend was used by, I believe, both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton on the campaign trail in 1999. And the tragedy is, as we had this end of history moment, it was also kind of the end of trade-offs for the American foreign policy elite. The United States cut its defense spending because it had no major rivals. Russia was flattened. China was, much weaker than the China we know today. So the United States emerges by the end of the 1990s in a stronger relative position, possibly than ever. People are making comparisons at that point to, we're stronger than any empire in history.
Yep.
And it's been cutting its defense spending. So if you can keep this going, there's not going to be much domestic discontent. Foreign policymakers think, we now rule the roost. We rule, the country. The public is behind us, and also, the world. What's the world going to do? And so this sets us up for a series of tragedies. And by the numbers, the United States has undertaken more frequent use of armed force since 1991 than it did during the Cold War itself. And it's not even close, according to the Congressional Research Service.
Lunacy.
So what we have is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where, the United States seeks dominance. It's like classic imperial overstretch. This creates, it generates antagonisms. There are real threats, but they're threats mostly to America's power position, which we've equated with our vital interest, and not to what I would consider to be American interests, the safety, the well-being of the American people at home. And so, this brings then real attacks. I mean, 9/11 happened. And then once that happens, as we've talked about, once events happen, then you got to do something, right? Like, I definitely thought that there should be use of force to punish the attackers after 9/11. And I make no apologies for that. What we ended up doing in Afghanistan went way beyond that goal. And we're still doing it.
And one could argue that was never the goal in Afghanistan. People have argued that was not. I mean, by the administration, they were interested in much more, right?
Well, the administration was, clearly reacted to 9/11, immediately talking about Iraq as a possible target.
Right. Yeah, it's just one megalomaniac after another. I mean, that's how I read it. I mean, there's no other way to explain it. So what is the Quincy Institute's position on, let's take military spending? What do you guys think should be the budget for the military?
Well, I have to give you the good wonky answer that, you should have a strategy, and you should. It's true. Yeah. Then you should have a budget that actually fits the strategy. Okay. So we've put out, a pretty detailed report on the Middle East, where basically we think the United States does not need much of a, shouldn't just end the endless wars with ground troops and wind down the war on terror. It doesn't need much of a permanent military presence at all. Maybe one or two bases if you're really cautious and you're worried about, access to the maritime commons being denied. But, that's it.
Right. So like pirates and stuff. You're talking about like Somali pirates stopping like oil shipments or something like
that in part, but also, if you get to some what are pretty far-fetched scenarios based on the world we're in, where, I don't know, a more powerful China or Iran, try to close off the Gulf. I don't think the United States needs to be at the forefront of an activity, but it's possible. And there's a fight against terrorism, which we're in, and trying to end that is not an easy thing, shall we say? So,
I think
how so?
I think doing what you are proposing would end terrorism. There would be no reason. There would be no reason to attack Americans if we were no longer in the Middle East. If someone comes from the Middle East and attacks Americans after that, then they are just criminals. I mean, they make no sense. I mean, now there is actually some rationale for terrorism, right? Because we have been torturing that poor region for decades, right? So you guys don't actually have a number, huh?
So I don't have a number. I don't have a golden number for you, but right now the number is, we're spending more than $1 trillion a year on national security. About $750 billion on the Pentagon. If we're actually coming up with a national security strategy that makes Americans safer, because I think what we're doing with more spending makes Americans less safe. Mm-hmm. It brings enemies to us and against us. The number, I cannot believe it's not a lot smaller than that. But I don't have a magical number for you. It would be BS if I had one.
Okay. I mean, Ron Paul has said all we need is one submarine on each coast and a small standing army. I mean, the guy wasn't he on the Foreign Relations Committee for decades? I mean, he knows a thing or two. I mean, this was his specialty, was foreign policy. You don't have to agree with him, but he does know about it. He does know about the military, and he does know about foreign policy. So I kind of like that. About 10% of what we have now is, I think, what he was calling for, something like that on the order. And that sounds about right. 10% is still a very large military, by the way. It's still we can still kill a lot of people.
Yeah, I think we should have a potent military. I think we should have nuclear deterrence, by the way.
Wow.
It adds to the security provided by the oceans. Okay. But I'm not against that either.
Okay.
And
does the Quincy Institute have a formal position on these things?
No, we have some principles, but I should. This is a great opportunity for me to say I'm speaking for myself. That's it.
Yeah, right. I wanted to be clear.
And so there are lots of. It's a pretty big tent organization.
Okay.
It's transpartisan, and we have disagreements on the substance of foreign policy as well. So that's perfectly fine.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is indeed transpartisan. So you and I have a couple of things in common. One is that we were both Columbia PhDs in history, and two is that both of us have been paid by both the Koch brothers and George Soros.
Okay.
We have both gotten money from both entities. The Koch brothers and is it the Soros Foundation? Is that it? The actual?
So it's the Charles Koch Foundation and Open Society Foundation.
Right. So they are funding the Quincy Institute, which was that was the big news when you guys opened your doors last year. And a lot of people on the left were like, "Oh my God, they can't do this. This doesn't make any sense. The Koch brothers couldn't possibly be on the right side of foreign policy questions. They have to be." It turns out they're libertarians. Oh, I see. Oh, and libertarians are
Right.
As a matter of, it turns out they're actually more anti-war and anti-imperialist than most people who are liberals. Okay. So it does make a whole lot of sense that they would join with George Soros. Well, maybe not. I don't know. But it certainly would make sense that they would fund a think tank that is hostile to the idea of an American empire.
That's correct. Yeah. So I've actually, I need to stop right now.
Did George just call you?
He did not. It's got nothing to do with the question.
Okay.
But my better half has an emergency, so
okay,
I'm going to need to take care of that.
We can go now. We're good now. We're fine. This has been great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quincy Institute. Check it out. It's brand new. When I have you back on, we'll talk about that more. But we did an amazingly good job. You are a tremendous scholar. I love your book, even where I disagree with it. I've learned from you just in this conversation, and continue doing what you're doing. I'm going to keep pushing you from the left or whatever, the anti-interventionist side.
Whatever it is, yeah.
You guys are a little soft for me, but I still love your general direction. So, Stephen, go take a emergency. And thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you so much.
All right. Peace.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. If you want to get the full presentation of the arguments that I briefly discuss in this episode with Stephen Wertheim, go to renegadeuniversity.com and enroll in the courses Dangerous Nation and The Great Blowback. Those are my courses on the history of U.S. foreign policy between the founding and the Spanish-American War, and my course on World War II. So go to renegadeuniversity.com, and by the way, when you become a member, you also get to participate, if you want, in our wonderful weekly RU Live sessions with guest experts just like Stephen Wertheim. So join us at RU. I hope to see you there. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.